There's nothing like a classic 70s car to get the adrenaline flowing. Something about those sleek designs, the regal colors, and engine hum make you crave a highway drive. If that sounds like you, go through some of the best cars from the 70s with us. Even if you are not a big car person, and we hope that by the end of this video you will be, you must have heard of Cadillac, and what better model to talk about than the Eldorado? Considered the gem of the company as it would always be sitting at the top of their sales reports. This car first dropped in 1953, but by the time of the decade of flashiness, there had already been 8 entire generations of the beauty. This redesign saw the car reimagined as a front-wheel coupe with a hardtop, and it was considered to be Cadillac's first step into the market for luxury cars. We have to say, that is certainly one way to make a statement. Everything under the hood was just as impressive as the design, with a 425 automatic turbo-hydromatic transmission and the latest technology which led it to achieving speeds of 70 mph in around just a few seconds. Now this might be a name that only car heads will recognize, but in that world it is quite a legendary one. The Continental Mark series was an entire lineup of luxury cars that the Ford Motor Company held as their pride and joy for a long while. In the 1970s, the Mark IV and Mark V models were particularly popular. Even the Mark III was doing pretty well, despite there being 2 new variants to contend with, but people adored the design of the car, such as the dented windows or the grille and deck lid. Plus, it was within these 3 cars that the Ford 460 cubic-inch V8 engine first made its debut. These vehicles were considered the most advanced in the market at the time, so anything that's in the car's manufacturing is top of the end by default. It also was the first brand to ever do radial tires. The biggest benefit of this series was all the customer choice that was now available. They had a luxury car that fit anyone's preferences in a decade where personal style and identity made you very cool. General Motors also made some big moves during the years of 1966 to 1980, and few will forget the Oldsmobile Toronado. For a long while, this was the closest thing we had to a functioning Batmobile, both in terms of its look and its capabilities. It has an impressive resume for a car, with it being the first front-wheel drive in the USA since the 30s, and having a tire specifically designed for it, meaning no others would work on the car. It screamed royalty in every sense of the word, yet had the charming comfort of a car you might find your dad driving. Plus, as far as the technical aspects go, a Super Rocket V8 with 385 horsepower and a heavy-duty 3-speed automatic transmission meant that it would always gather one hell of a crowd at car shows. The 1970 Buick Riviera was a sight to see, showing up in beige, with vertical bar grills wrapped around a new front bumper, a 7.5 engine boasting 360 horsepower, and several other features that made sure it did incredible, even if there would be a redesign just the next year. That model followed a different look, with boat-tail styling, and was supervised by Bull Mitchell with his direction. While it was originally meant to be a smaller, A-body-based look, they went for a much lengthier design. When you think about what a vintage 70s American car looks like, this is probably the first thing that pops up in your head, and is also the reason why the phrase, "she's a Buick," became a popular compliment. Part of the big hitters in what was known as the fuselage era, the Chrysler Imperial was the flagship of the Chrysler Corporation and the highlight of the Imperial division of theirs as a whole. There are some things in life that you just take a look at and know they are the best in their world or field, and the Imperial lived up to its name by giving off that exact impression. Truly, one would need just a glance to figure out that this was a car for the elite, for the deeply passionate, or for those with imperial levels of money. It was another time in the car world of sheer automotive superiority. Was the best thing the fashionable steering wheel? The tail lamps that were sunken ever so slightly into the canted bumper? The beveled trunk lid or the large low-hanging roof that gave it an air of silent confidence? Either way, this car was the jewel of every fanatic's eyes. One of the best pillarless hardtops you would find out there, the Grand Prix Pontiac was one of the brand's best intermediate personal luxury cars. Their focus for the 1969 Pontiac was to be an all-rounder with a marketing scheme focused on making customers know that this car drove as good as it looked, if not better. manual transmissions, several engine options and two different engine sizes, 390 horsepower, and bucket seats with a console fully integrated into an instrument panel so that you had maximum comfort. You also had an electric rear window defogger, so really, while this was one expensive purchase you would want for nothing else if this was the choice you were making. It sold over 112,000 units, and considering each car cost more than $4,000, you can imagine how much money that is. It even inspired the looks of other cars like the Monte Carlo and some Ford and Chrysler models. It is a good time to mention Monte Carlo since that is next on our list. We are not even halfway through yet, and the cars so far have already set quite the standard. However, what about a bit more of a tamer car? Maybe you are not one for all the spectacle and novelty of a Buick, an Imperial, or a Grand Prix. This was the car for you because it had enough in common with them while still being a bit more low-key. Sure, it had an A-body chassis, just like the Buicks, but it would also have chrome grills, normal round headlamps, and a two-barrel carburetor along with a small block V8. What's all that mean? It did not pack the same power, but it looked the part and came close enough. Some of what was beneath its surface was cutting-edge stuff, and some of it was industry standard like the front disc brakes. All of it was worth every penny though, and it still holds a lot of value as a vintage collectible. The Ford Thunderbird was a hardtop sedan that was widely believed to be the best in the game, or at least in the top 3 as a bare minimum. Doubling both as a sports car and a personal luxury car, it came with many different options, including the choice between a 4-seat convertible or a Dix passenger hardtop coupe. If that was too excessive, they also gave a 5-seater option. Really looking out for those families with a gaggle of kids and the ones with just one, right? If you do recall the glory days of this unit, then you can thank Louis Crusoe for spearheading the development so wonderfully, as well as William P. Boyer, an incredible designer for Ford who worked on the original 2-seater. They also had a fun little his and hers scheme in 1971 with 2 different models sold as pairs, with all kinds of features like tape recorders and telephones. Lincoln Mercury dropped the Mercury Cougar in 1966, but the sales from this beast would continue to fund the company's mechanical adventures for a long time after. In fact, there was a point where the Cougar itself was almost half the company's sales with a price of $2,854. This model got the Car of the Year award, and it was the only car from Lincoln Mercury to win that title. It had a 3-speed manual transmission, but some other models had 4-speed manual ones or automatic 4-speed ones. This car sold well into the 70s, even when it got a redesign to a straight-line body and a convertible body style with XR7 trims. It also looked stunning in cyan and brown, which are pretty hard colors for a car to work properly. The 1970 Dodge Charger was an incredibly wanted item even before it first hit the market. If this were a video game list, this one would be sitting at the top for having the most amount of pre-orders. Unfortunately, you did not have that option back then with cars, so people had to wait until the first 96,100 units dropped, and yes, they really did make that many just to begin with. The broad tail lights, the powertrains, and the horizontal grim on them were just a few design elements that made everyone show hard eyes when this rolled down the street. It sold much more than just 90-60-100 though, and we think not even Dodge expected it to do that well. Not only was it marketed as a luxury car for you and yours, it was also something you could really race in, as it won the most NASCAR races in 1970. Dodge Chargers feel and look like something right out of Fast and Furious. What do you think? For a name like the Cutlass Supreme, Oldsmobile actually went with a mid-sized design for this, despite it being a premium car that sat at the very top of the Cutlass range, both in performance and price. The proof is right there, since it also sold the highest in that entire catalog and was one of the most demanded Oldsmobile productions ever made. Its rear-wheel drive and 2-door hardtop design made this car the epitome of style. It was one of the most elegant-looking sedans you could get your hands on, and the transverse front engine with 5.4 liters capacity and a 4-speed manual transmission for people who really like to test their driving skills. Nothing about driving a set of wheels like this would leave you unsatisfied, and that is exactly the luxury experience General Motors was looking to offer. The 5th generation of Plymouth Furies were when Chrysler truly hit gold. Their iconic two-door convertible style returned, as well as many other options for four doors and convertibles. The 1969 line of Furies came with three models, the Fury 1, 2, and 3. If only the people who were in charge of the naming were as creative and talented as the ones who came up with the mechanical aspects of the car especially. Having Fury as a name leaves a lot of room for iconic naming choices for different models, something this car had a lot of. The standard across all of them, though, was a 3-speed manual transmission with a torque flight automatic transmission being optional. This car left very little to be desired, and it truly felt like one very swaggy work of art. The company would keep its streak of surefire hits going with the Chrysler LeBaron, a luxury vehicle that took after the Dodge Aspen cars, which featured an F-body chassis. You could choose between a sedan or a coupe, and there was also a special town and country station wagon that was released in 1978 as part of a police package. It did incredible for the time it was in, since this was an extremely competitive era for cars, as you may have guessed by now. There was something about pulling up to any occasion or place driving this, and whether it was the beaming glow of sunlight being reflected off of that magnificent bumper, or the way it would go from 0 to 100 real quick, and very literally at that, a LeBaron made you feel big and important. While the Mercury Marquis was named after French royalty, it received a king's welcome in America as Ford first released the car in 1967. Sleek, focused, and not doing or saying too much with its design, the two-door hardtop sedan was quite a trendsetter in the car world, like how it also came with a vinyl roof, a first for luxury cars, as most prominent companies ditched that idea. The engine was very spacious, with the lowest being 6.4 liters and the highest being 7.0 liters Super Marauder V8s. An FX-MX automatic transmission meant that the driving experience was smooth, almost flawless, really. There was a very responsive link between you and your car that felt as instantaneous as the mind sending signals to the muscles, which really immerses anyone in the driving experience. There is a lot to say about this car, but all of it falls short, as you really had to be there to see the impact this had on people. Leather seats, a 225 V8 engine, power steering, brakes, windows and seats, and an incredible appetite for gasoline, the '73 Buick Electra was a sight to behold. It was as much a comfort car as it was a luxury one, with particularly incredible air conditioning. This car was meant to be an incredibly stylish option that could also work as the family car, and many Buick Electras were handed down from grandfather and grandmother to their child and then to grandchild. In this way, it became somewhat of a nostalgic heartthrob for several people. Though it did intend to be a family car, it consumed gas a bit too fast for it to be a reliable one. Despite that, some people would keep these as a ride for very special occasions if they could afford to. The 11th generation of Oldsmobile 98s were absolute bombshells, to say the least. While there were many models that continued the spirit of this car's design and the sensation of driving it, none would ever come close to the 1977 ones. These were simply in a league of their own, featuring 8-cylinder engines, rear-wheel drive, and Buick V6, meaning they packed just as much of a punch as you'd expect. It ran on diesel and had a pretty fair consumption for a high-end car. Did you know it also set a new sales record for the company? 139,423 units sold is nothing to laugh at, even if the vehicle in question is a not-so-humble 4-door sedan. Widely known as the largest Chevrolet ever built, the 1971 Chevrolet Caprice, as well as the downsized 1977 versions, really left quite an impression on anybody that took hold of their steering well. However, just being daunting is not this car's only unique selling point. Between winning Motor Trend's Car of the Year and selling hundreds of thousands of units, the Caprice left a mark in the industry that other competitors found very hard to measure up against. Not that this should come as a surprise, as the developers intended to have it contend with Plymouth's VIP and Ford's LTD, which were both doing very well in the business. One thing about Caprices was that no matter what kind of person you were, the interior definitely drew you in. A wood dashboard, sound insulation, thick carpeting, the finest leather in the States, and the option between a coupe, hardtop, or a station wagon meant that this car appealed to a lot of audiences. There are few cars that people agree on being pure 10 on 10s, but the Caprice came very close to that standard. The king of muscle cars was probably the Buick Centurion. Despite having a very short reign over America's showrooms, garages, and illegal street races, the car sold 110,549 units, despite being canceled soon after its release. A piston-crafted convertible with the choice of a drop or hard top. Perhaps the only complaint was that it was a two-seater. However, most perceived flaws would fade away very quickly once the roar of its 7.5-liter powerhouse engine would shatter all the noise in your head and surroundings. While other cars at this point had different engine options, this only gave customers one engine, but with two different tuning setups. Also, it looked extremely classy in black, like a ride fit for Greek royalty. The Plymouth Duster was just as successful as the Fury was, and the 1970 version came in two types of models. You had your standard Duster, which was still an extremely solid deal that most people found it very hard to pass up on, and then you had a performance-based Duster 340. We are not quite sure why this trend of letting you have different takes on the same car died out, but it needs to come back. Now, the engine space was actually a little low here, with the standard Duster giving you 3 liters. The 340 still fixed this with a whopping 5.5 liters. The Duster itself, despite some small nitpicks here and there, was an unbelievable success. Even Dodge asked for their very own version. When your rivals want a piece of your pie, you know you have made it. The first subcompact car both for Ford and on this list is unfortunately also the last one, but the Ford Pinto was a classic with funky taillights and 3 different bodies you could try. You had your 2-door fastback sedan equipped with a spacious trunk, and then you had a 3-door hatchback. Lastly, they put out a 2-door station wagon. While this car looked great and drove well with its select-shift automatic transmission, it also raised a lot of controversy. The Pinto's fuel tank was infamous for being very prone to fires, and several incidents had occurred in collisions. Basically, even more so than others, you really did not want to get hit when driving this car. Ford did take all of this into account and worked out this issue in subsequent models, but it caused quite a stir back in the day. That's it for fancy cars from the 1970s. Let us know your thoughts on the class of these cars. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive.